He yelled so loud the glass shook. Coffee dripped off the $1 million contract. The intern froze, 22, shaking, eyes like porcelain. "Pack your things," he said. "You're done." 3 days later, that same intern was dead, and the man who fired her couldn't stop reading her last unfinished email. Ethan Cole made a career out of being unshockable. He spoke with the certainty of someone who had learned to measure every risk, to trim every indulgence, to see emotion as an obstacle rather than an asset. His company, Cole Dynamics, was his machine, sleek, efficient, unfeeling. He'd built it by cutting soft edges and refusing second chances. His reputation traveled faster than his handshake, precise, cold, absolute. The morning started like any other. Glass towers cut the sky into boxes of light. The boardroom smelled faintly of coffee and authority. Executives sat in neat lines, laptops open, palms rested on polished wood. Ethan stood at the head, tie perfect, jaw tight, his voice the metronome that made people quicken and quiet. "Quarter projections are acceptable only if we increase margin," he said. "No excuses. We're presenting, closing, and moving on." He did not intend to be cruel. To him, cruelty was a byproduct of truth. Efficiency demanded decisions, and decisions demanded consequences. The door opened, and a young woman stepped in with a tray. She was new, an intern who'd started 2 weeks earlier. Emily Turner. Her resume said bright, her hands said different. She carried 6 cups of coffee, breaths shallow, eyes fixed on the floor as if that would steady her. "You're late," Ethan said without looking up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. The elevator—" she started. "Excuses waste time. Set them down," he snapped. Her fingers trembled. One cup wobbled. The world narrowed. A clink, a tilt, a dark arc of coffee spraying across the table and over the papers that lay open. The contract Ethan had signed that morning before the meeting. The numbers still warm with ink. Silence hit like wind against a window. I'm so sorry," Emily stammered, voice thin. Ethan did not shout at first. He let the room do it for him. Eyes widened, chairs shifted, paper rustled with sudden care. When he spoke, his voice was the worst kind of weapon. Calm, deliberate. "Do you understand what this is?" he asked. "Do you understand what you ruined?" "I can clean it. I'll—" Her words fell away. "Get out," he said. The dismissal landed like a verdict. She left clutching napkins and a dignity that was already fraying. The meeting continued, because meetings always continued. The stain on the contract was wiped, replaced, notarized again. People moved on because they had to. Ethan moved on because the company required it. He slept like a man whose life runs on schedules, not on conscience. 3 days later, his assistant left a note on his desk. "Email from Emily Turner. Subject, thank you." He did not expect anything that could touch him. He opened it while waiting for the elevator. The message was short, abrupt, unfinished. "Mr. Cole, thank you for the opportunity. I know I messed up. I didn't mean to ruin your day. The sentence stopped. There was no signature. No finishing punctuation. The email had been scheduled for that morning. Sent, apparently, in error. Ethan frowned and closed the laptop. He did not read it again until HR called. "Mr. Cole, there's been an accident." The voice was smaller than a whisper. "Emily Turner was hit by a car this morning. She didn't survive." For a man who had insulated himself against surprises, the news unfolded like a crack in glass, precise, sharp, and suddenly everywhere. Ethan stayed at his desk until the light in the office shifted from steel to something darker. Outside, the city kept its indifferent rhythm. Inside, his suit felt like a costume worn in the wrong play. He tried to measure it, as if guilt could be quantified. He thought about the coffee, the stain, the way her hands had trembled. He thought about the unfinished sentence. He thought about the simplicity of that little fragment. A promise never finished, a life cut while meaning to start. The next morning, he did not go to a meeting. He ordered the assistant to cancel everything, and when she asked why, he said, "I need a day." He walked, instead, down to the street where Emily had been crossing. People rushed by with earbuds and appointments and lives that did not make room for pauses. He stood on the curb and watched cars pass. a line of metal and motion indifferent. At the crosswalk there were flowers and a note taped to a pole. Someone had written, "Sorry, Emily." The paper trembled in the wind, as fragile as the apology felt. He left, but something had lodged in his chest. An unwanted weight, not unlike a bruise. Over the next days the office air changed. People watched him. Not with the kind of fear that had kept them small before. This was curiosity, tentative and new. He walked the halls and noticed things he had never seen. The receptionist, who slipped an extra hour at a desk for no overtime. The intern who ate lunch in a corner because saving cash made sense. The custodian who had a daughter at home and always left at midnight. He had been efficient at ignoring. He requested HR files. He read termination notes and performance reviews until the words blurred into one another. Incompetence, negligence, failure to meet standards. Intern after intern had been dismissed, some for genuine inability, others for mistakes that happened once, and then became a reason to close the door. He found Emily's file. Her file contained nothing but a bright resume and a stack of polite thank you notes. There was no flag, no note that suggested she was a threat. Just a moment. The coffee, the meeting room, the dismissal. Ethan began to sleep badly. He dreamed he was at a table with an empty chair across from him and a cup of coffee sitting in the middle. He would wake up, and it would still be there, as if waiting for someone who would never arrive. He could have let it burn out. Another statistic in the hallways of power. But something in him had been cracked open. It hurt, in the way a bruise hurts, not sharp, but persistent. A week later he called a company-wide meeting. The board expected numbers, strategies, the sort of performance that answered with charts. Instead, Ethan stood before them and said, "We are changing policy." He did not use the language of public relations. He did not call it a gesture. He called it a duty. "Effective immediately," he said, voice steady and small. "No employee will be terminated for a single mistake without an established mentorship and correction plan. We will institute review periods. We will train. We will fund education. We will be precise about compassion." People blinked. The HR director mouthed, "Why?" in a small, incredulous arc. Ethan did not answer, because the explanation would have sounded like vanity. He wanted the policy to stand on its own. He wanted action to look like action. They called it the Turner policy, in a quiet, unofficial way. He signed a memo, and then, in private, he called Emily's mother. Mrs. Turner lived in a modest flat on the edge of the city. She opened the door and looked at him not with curiosity but with the weary dignity of someone who had come to expect the world's indifference. "You're Mr. Cole," she said simply. "Yes." He put his hand in his pocket and found an envelope. The gesture felt small but necessary. He handed it to her. Inside was money meant to cover funeral expenses and more, a figure that could buy time and a little breathing room. She thanked him with the kind of voice that hides too many things. "Make it mean something," she said when he hesitated. He did. The company funded a scholarship in Emily's name. They wrote checks to internships that would cover transportation and meals and anything that kept a young person from being hungry during their first week of work. He opened a training center in the building, a place where new hires would learn not only skills, but the culture he now said he wanted them to have. He put Emily's photo on the entrance wall of the Turner Center, a small plaque that read, "For those who deserve a second moment." He walked past it every morning, his steps feeling like a confession. The change was not immediate. Systems are stubborn things. Old managers grumbled. Investors asked for efficiency metrics, but the new policy altered habits. Mentors were assigned. People who would have been thrown out were taught. Mistakes became curriculum instead of termination points. Ethan found himself in rooms he had avoided, the break room, the late-night coding bench, spaces where people tasted the edges of exhaustion. He listened. He sat with employees whose names he had never known. He did not grandstand. He sat and took notes and asked questions he had not asked before. "What do you need? How can we fix this? Who helps you when this happens?" Sometimes he learned small things. A transit card would make a difference. A reference letter would open a door. A paid sick day would keep someone from having to choose between health and rent. Sometimes he learned larger things. People wanted to be seen, not judged. Months passed, and a strange thing happened. The company's metrics did not collapse. In quiet, measured ways, they improved. People stayed longer. Internship programs filled with ambitious kids who felt safer to try, to fail, to learn. The rumor of change spread beyond the payroll. Recruiters noticed. People wanted to work at Coal Dynamics because it had become a place where a mistake might cost you a day of training, but not your life's trajectory. There were nights Ethan could not turn away from the thought of the unfinished sentence in Emily's email. He would sit at his desk, cup of coffee cooling, and trace the letters on his phone screen. I'll what? He had never known what to say to death. All he had was a compulsion to act. On the anniversary of the spill, he returned to the crosswalk where Emily, had fallen. He stood for a long time. A woman approached him with a bouquet. He realized she had worked in another company, had heard the story, and had come to leave flowers. People had started to claim Emily in small ways, a mark on their conscience that made them better. Ethan announced a public lecture series and an annual scholarship in Emily's name. But what he valued more were the private things he began doing. He walked through the office and actually greeted people. He remembered to ask interns about their commute. He invited one young coder to lunch and listened as she talked about the code she was writing and the mother she supported. He offered his time. He asked his managers to be kind without being indulgent. He also kept the stain. The contract that had been stained did not go into a drawer. He had it framed and hung it in his office. Not because the paper itself had meaning, but because the stain had. Some days he stood in front of it and felt the old certainty of his life crumble, not spectacularly, but in small chips, revealing something warmer beneath. Years later, journalists called it the coffee spill transformation and wrote tidy headlines about corporate empathy. But the truth lived in smaller spaces. The intern who, under the new policy, stayed and became a product manager. The janitor whose son was given a scholarship. The receptionist who no longer worked unpaid overtime. A culture shifted in tiny, meticulous ways. Ethan did not become sentimental overnight. He still disliked inefficiency. He still believed in strong decisions. But he had learned the difference between discipline and cruelty, between correction and abandonment. On a late winter afternoon, 10 years after the cup tipped, he poured a cup of coffee and walked into the training center. A young woman, a scholarship recipient, stood at the front preparing to present. Her voice was steady. At the back of the room, Ethan watched and then stepped forward. He placed his hand on the plaque with Emily's photo. The room stilled. He asked the presenter afterward if she would take lunch with him. She did. They ate across from each other at a small table, the same way Emily had once sat across from him shaking, the steam from their cups curling into the air. He listened more than he spoke. When he finally left, he tucked a small card into his pocket, a reminder, not unlike a talisman. Leave room for, to be finished. Sometimes the changes were ugly before they were beautiful. A man could not simply will himself kind. He could, however, decide to look at the things he had previously ignored. That, more than any press release, mattered. On quiet evenings, when the office lights dimmed and the city exhaled, Ethan stood at his window and imagined Emily in the small, absurd ways that made him both sad and grateful. The way she would have eaten lemon tart, how she might have cursed at the subway, the way she would have argued passionately about a product feature. He did not pretend to atone with money or policy alone. He tried, imperfectly, continuously, to turn the lesson into habit. He never got used to the silence that once followed him, but because of the spill, he learned to listen to it. He learned to let the unfinished verb stand as an invitation instead of a wound. I'll try, I'll help, I'll stay. And that was the smallest, most human revolution he could imagine. A company kept its edge. A man kept his job. A policy kept a young person's future from evaporating at the first mistake. A cup of coffee had cracked his armor. The crack didn't heal neatly. It let light in,